When someone becomes less available, it creates a pause in the interaction, and that pause alone is enough to change how the other person feels about the dynamic, even before they consciously understand what changed. What usually happens is simple. Communication used to be easy and predictable. You knew when you'd hear from them, and you knew roughly how conversations would go. You didn't think much about it because there was nothing to think about. Then, without any explanation, that predictability disappears. Replies don't come when you expect them anymore, and conversations end sooner than they used to. The effort feels lower than before, and it's usually not bad enough to confront, but different enough to notice. That difference is what matters. The brain reacts strongly when a pattern it relied on stops working the same way. It doesn't need drama or conflict. It just needs inconsistency. The moment something that used to feel stable becomes uncertain, attention turns toward it automatically. That's why people start thinking more when availability drops. Not because they suddenly care more, but because the situation now requires awareness. When things were predictable, the brain didn't need to watch them closely. When predictability disappears, the brain steps in to figure out what's going on. This is also why being fully present all the time doesn't create the same effect. Constant availability creates comfort, which lowers alertness. The mind relaxes when it feels safe and familiar. Over time, it stops actively noticing what's always there, even if it appreciates it. So when someone becomes less available, it's not the absence that creates impact, it's the loss of certainty. The interaction now feels unfinished instead of complete, and unfinished things naturally occupy more mental space than finished ones. This is where people get confused and start thinking in terms of tactics. They assume something intentional or manipulative is happening, but most of the time, this reaction has nothing to do with strategy. It's simply how the brain responds when access changes. Availability shapes how presence is interpreted. When someone is always reachable, their presence feels built into your routine. When they aren't, their presence feels like something you can't take for granted. The person didn't become more interesting. The situation became less automatic. That shift changes how every interaction feels. A message that would have been ignored before now carries more weight. A conversation feels more noticeable because it's no longer guaranteed. The mind assigns more importance to what feels limited, even if the content itself hasn't changed. There's also an emotional effect that comes from this pause. When someone is always around, you don't consciously register how much space they occupy in your life. Their presence blends into the structure of your day. When that presence is reduced, the space becomes visible. You become aware of what used to be there. This awareness can feel uncomfortable, not because something bad happened, but because something familiar is missing. That discomfort often gets interpreted as increased interest, when it's really increased awareness. Psychologically, this fits with how humans react to access and restriction. When access is unlimited, value feels stable but quiet. When access becomes limited, value feels urgent. The brain doesn't want to lose something it already had, so it pays closer attention. This doesn't mean people suddenly want something more. It means they're more aware of the possibility of losing it, and that awareness changes behavior. But here's the part that matters most. This effect only exists if the connection already meant something. Reduced availability doesn't create attachment from nothing. It highlights whatever was already there. If someone cared, the pause makes them notice. If they didn't, the pause makes it easier for them to detach. Distance doesn't add value, it reveals it. That's why becoming less available can feel clarifying. It shows you how much of the connection depended on your constant presence. It reveals whether effort was mutual or one-sided, not through confrontation, but through reaction. There's also a limit to how far this can go. If availability drops too much, presence stops mattering at all. The brain adapts to absence the same way it adapts to presence. Over time, uncertainty turns into acceptance, attention fades, and the effect disappears. This is usually where boundaries come in, even if you don't think of them that way. Not rules, not some big statement, just quiet limits. You stop giving everything by default. You protect your time and energy without explaining yourself every time. And when that happens, something important changes. You're no longer carrying the entire dynamic on your own. The relationship either finds balance or it slowly weakens based on what was actually there to begin with. That shift can feel uncomfortable at first. Clarity usually does, but it's also grounding. Over time, you start feeling steadier, not because people suddenly behave better, but because you're no longer stretching yourself just to keep things consistent. Your presence becomes more intentional. You show up when it makes sense, not out of habit. People notice that. They might not talk about it or fully understand it, but they feel it. You come across more centered, less reactive, less dependent on constant back and forth. And what's interesting is that this doesn't push the right people away. People who actually value you don't need unlimited access to stay connected. They adjust naturally. They respect the change without making it a problem. The people who fade were often responding to how available you were, not to who you are. And when that dynamic falls away, it creates space for something healthier. That's why becoming less available isn't about control or strategy. It's about alignment. It's about letting your presence match your real capacity instead of everyone else's expectations. Keep in mind that your time isn't endless and your energy isn't either. When you start treating them that way, people take the cue. So what really happens when you become less available isn't drama or manipulation. It's just awareness. And it's the dynamic finally revealing what it was built on in the first place. And that's not something to avoid. That's something worth understanding.